Welcome to Friendly Disruption. This is episode 16. We're with Denise DeCoste, and she is going to talk to us a lot today about UPAR, and it's a wonderful tool. I'm really messing this up already, aren't I? and as I talked, Denise has led all sorts of AT teams. She's been a practitioner for a number of years. She now resides in Cape Cod. And we are so thrilled she's decided to join us tonight. Along with us as normal is Patrick and Maggie. So we're just going to kick right into it and start talking. I'm not even sure what a good entry question is. We probably should have had this conversation. We were talking offline right before the broadcast started, and we were having this really great conversation. And then I didn't think, well, how are we going to kick it off? Well, one of the things we were talking a little bit about was the idea of teaching reading in terms of reader decoding and those sorts of skills in parallel with tools like UPAR and text to speech. And so maybe we could start there. So with that, I'm going to throw it open to the rest of the panel, and let's just start.
Well,
so Denise,
yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I remember, I don't know, was it 5 years ago now that we beta tested the Universal Protocol for Accommodations in Reading in the state of Iowa. And I remember beta testing that product and thinking to myself, this is going to change the face of education for kids with high incidence disabilities.
I don't know.
What do you think about that?
I would, in my wildest, now it's been about 5 years now, I agree, since about UPAR's been out. And, we've been using, in our district, Linda Wilson and I kind of came up with the paper-based version of UPAR well before Don Johnston approached us about automatizing it and putting it on computer, allowing it to be used in computer with groups of students. And in our wildest dreams, we knew it was working for us, but in our wildest dreams, we did not think it would have the impact that it's having, because we were using it in the paper-based version in a one-to-one kind of format, right? One student at a time. But once the automated version came along and you were able to evaluate groups of kids and you had the strength of group data, we were just hearing stories that were sort of blowing our minds in terms of kids that were assumed their intelligence was questioned because they were non-readers or limited readers, and that amazes me that we're still in that place where if a student doesn't read well, we assume that's an intellectual issue, and so that really concerns me. The number of stories that we hear about kids who just start crying, or parents that start crying. I mean, I just heard 2 more stories yesterday about that, who say, I knew I could do this, I didn't, or I thought I was stupid, or I couldn't do this, or I didn't, can I tell my grandmother? That's the one that made me cry the most. Can I call my grandmother and tell her, kind of thing? Because this little guy was just so thrilled that he was able to demonstrate that he could comprehend at well above his grade level, actually. So yeah, I would love to. I'm really pretty proud of the fact that we ended up with a product that is not only changing the lives of kids, but is also the beginning of courageous conversations at schools. And I would, even in line with your broadcast here, disruptive conversations at schools about what is reading, about what kinds of, when you see these kinds of discrepancies in kids in the UPAR data, what does that say to principals, and how are principals responding to this? Are they saying, oh my gosh, we've got to get more technology to support these kids? And they are. I mean, it's actually bringing up the conversation about what should we do to support these students. So I'm thrilled for the students, but I'm thrilled for the conversations that are starting as a result of it.
Yeah, I think to me, that's the thing that just is fascinating about this, because, we're starting to, at Prairie, I shouldn't say we anymore because I'm starting to exit there, but at Prairie, they're starting to think about giving the UPAR as more of a universal tier tool, right? So they've already eased it out, and you see this where it's just stark data where you see kids who are not identified with any reading goal in IEP or anything, but they're still reading a couple grade levels below where they should be independently. and yet their comprehension oftentimes with a text reader is maybe a couple grade levels above where they're supposed to be.
And the scenario that I often hear that I think that sort of tugs at my heart, which is these kids are at reading time, or for reading purposes, like reading novels or reading other kinds of fiction, nonfiction books, that these kids are put on leveled readers because they cannot read at grade level. When after UPAR, they find that they can put these kids using read aloud tools on the grade level text. And for the first time, these kids can have conversations about the books that the rest of their peers are reading. They can talk about the characters, they can engage in conversation, and the books are way more interesting. I mean, the kids say they don't want to read those baby books kind of thing.
One of the things that that they noticed at Prairie, at least too, is that oftentimes these kids who were identified with that scenario I just provided were often some of the most problematic kids in terms of behaviors too.
Yeah.
And it makes perfect sense. Why would you be well behaved or follow through with the social contract implied in those classrooms when you know you're being set up for failure? None of us would rationally choose to do that.
And it also gets to the research around shame, that students that the shame they feel about being non-readers, and this actually starts very early in elementary school, that the shame they feel around being a non-reader is equivalent to the shame around incest, which I cannot get over, but that's what the research says. So these kids will do anything to then not be embarrassed by the fact that they can't read. And if acting out is one of those behaviors, then that's what they're going to do.
Yeah, that's Daniel and Kelly gave that same piece of research, and I think that's so powerful. And I can tell you, as a struggling reader myself, I fit that profile. I'm not the victim of incest, so I can't speak to that, but I can tell you with certainty that there's a great deal of it's shaped my whole adult life.
Yeah. And that's the other thing. I mean, if you really have a certain degree of dyslexia, it doesn't go away. So no amount, I mean, we know that there's some of the research that's coming out now that we've been doing reading interventions for, a fair number of years here, some of the research will say around 7%, some of the research will say around 19% of kids are actually resistant to reading interventions. Maybe because they're on the wrong reading intervention, or maybe because their deficits are so severe that they can't get over the decoding hurdle.
Well, and go ahead, Patrick. I was just going to call out to somebody else to talk, so perfect.
The conference I was at recently, we had Eric Kurtz as our keynote talking about the bionic educator. He was kind of using the fact that technology with AI and everything, how much has changed and how much, one statement I think they made was like, and I think you could replace teacher with learner on this, is that, the best teacher is not a human. It's not a computer. It's actually a human using a computer. And I think the best learner then is using those digital tools to fix or to replace any of the issues that are facing them. And so, I can't talk from the reading side of it just because, I have no issues with that, but I had, the hearing as a kid, it's the same thing too. It's just that if you don't feel like you fit that standard mold of what the ideal student is, you always feel behind or different or out of place. And so yet using that technology to finally meet your needs, learn as best you can. And, we've been using the Snap and Read tool all this year, last year. I've been working a lot with our reading instructionist, works with some of our students who are special ed or have some sort of identified goal. And just some of those kids finally be able to read using the tool, the same text as their classmates. It's just been fun talking with them because it's seen so much growth in those students this year. But yeah, just shouldn't be ignoring the fact that technology is here. We can use it.
The whole issue of bionic is an interesting, that we use that word because I was just reading an article about a researcher at MIT, and he invented, he was actually a double amputee from a mountain climbing accident, but at MIT he invented prosthetic limbs that are actually make connections with the brain so that when these limbs are moving, he can feel them moving. And so he said his question was, am I disabled anymore if I can run and climb the way that I used to? And I think it begs the question for, it may beg the question for reading as well. If we can give individuals tools early on that allow them access to reading and feeling successful about reading, that's a fantastic thing. I mean, the other thing that, well, I'll leave it there.
I think that's really interesting. So if this is the same article, I think I read this guy was also a high school dropout. Am I thinking, is this the same article?
I don't know, but what he talked about, and this is the point that I was going to make that I forgot, is that in the future, he really does predict that many people will have bionic elements. There will be bionic elements for sensory issues, for physical issues, for emotional issues, and for cognitive issues.
Yeah.
This will not be that unusual maybe 50 years from now. So
well, again, it's kind of a preference thing. And the other thing I would say, just as someone, again, speaking from personal experience, you know, there's positive and negative feedback loops associated with education, at least in our current structures. And I think that'll always be true, but I think they're amplified in our current structures. And tools like Snap and Read, or we use Read and Write from Text Help at Prairie. It doesn't really matter which one you pick, as long as you have one that's decently functional. And the fact is that when kids have the opportunity to experience success breeds success. You know, it breeds that positive feedback loop, and you're going to get people who are going to be more actively decoding unless there's just a physical reason why they can't. You have a hard time convincing me that there's any, you know, that if, unless you're just purely neglecting that and making a conscious effort not to teach it, that there's not just going to be improvement along those lines. And I think we see that all the time. That's just the way that society is in fact trending. And I think that's referenced in your discussion with this gentleman from MIT too. I mean, you know, we can't, I don't know that you can imagine a world without your cell phone. And yet, you know, I'm 50 years old. I can, you know, live half to 3/4 of my life without one, you know, and did so reasonably successfully. But now I can't imagine, and no one would think differently about that.
My cell phone is my bionic memory now. I mean,
right.
I Evernote, so, you know.
You know, I think you guys have all, in things that you've said, have just, my brain has just gone to kids knowing themselves and knowing what they need and being able to determine and advocate and just be able to know enough about themselves. I'm thinking about self-determination, self-agency. What is the UPAR in the conversations you've had with folks across the country? What has UPAR done on that front? Because I think in my experience, it's pretty
immediate. That's what's in the stories that we hear. We don't hear all of the stories, but in the stories we hear, it's almost immediate because these kids can read data. They've been raised in the educational system to be able to read simple, you know, data graphs. So they get it really, really quickly. And then, in fact, one of the Lindsay, who presented with me in Iowa on UPAR, she gave an example. I think she gave an example of a student who immediately started into self-agency. And this is a student who was reading really below his grade level. I mean, really below his grade level, not even close. And he immediately said, okay, what happens? Can I get a computer? Can I do it on my phone? I mean, this self-agency happened immediately upon him seeing the data. We hear about kids who are become self-advocates for getting books off Bookshare, like, you know, constantly haranguing their teacher. Can you get this book for me now? Can you get this book for me now? Kids who were really reluctant readers, all of a sudden being avid readers. So that's pretty exciting. And I think that is important, that whole self-agency, the whole knowing how you learn best and advocating for yourself to help you get those opportunities. That's the thing that surprises me about UPAR is kids take to it very quickly and own it, and teachers feel bad that they didn't know about it. They didn't realize that there was this discrepancy and that they could have that there was a solution available for them.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to, again, that I think I referenced the beta testing that we did in a school district, actually the school district I graduated from. And I remember watching a student walk into an assessment. We started in one room, our screener, his session. He sat down to a computer, put his earbuds in, and started. 40 minutes later, that period was over, and he was still working. I was like, okay, so we're just going to pause it. Let's go to the next room. Sat him down. The next group of students came in, worked through their assessment. He was still working. It was an hour and a half later, and the student's like, I'm done. And I finally was like, what? And I remember thinking to myself, I wish I would have timed that first reading that he did. It had to have taken him an hour to decode that one passage at grade level. And the next two went so slick. One passage. It took him so long. And so I went to his teacher. I said, what's his deal? She goes, well, he's reading at grade level. It just takes him a long time. I said, oh, honey, it takes him such a long time. So we sat him down. We had a conversation with him. And we said, how does this feel? And he was like, I love this. I could do this all day long. And we said, well, we're going to do this for you. We got a computer that day for him. Got him set up with a text reader. Next, I think I was in a week or two later. He's like, hey, Maggie, help me get my Spanish book. I need this to read in Spanish to me. And this was the kid, he walked in with earbuds on, his iPod on, just walked in, shoulders down, wasn't looking at anybody, wouldn't look at anybody. He walked around that school from that day on. His head was up. He was talking to people. It didn't just change his ability to advocate for himself or his ability. It changed, like we said earlier, the way he saw himself as a learner. And it made the difference. And I think that's what this tool offers. What have been the barriers, though? Like, are there barriers?
Are there barriers to the use of UPAR? Yeah, there is one barrier that I'm concerned about, that people think that you have to be in a one-to-one program in order to really, there's no point exploring UPAR because we're not in a one-to-one program. That really concerns me a lot. So that's kind of a practice barrier of some sort, or it's not quite a policy barrier, but I think it's a practice barrier that really does concern me. There are barriers. There shouldn't be barriers to people thinking, well, I can't have this because I don't know if we can get the money for it, and I don't know if they've even tried to get the money for it, kind of thing, and or nobody's ever picked up the phone and called Don Johnston to see what kind of a pricing structure that they can get. So some people just don't explore it to the next level because they think, well, we're not a computer one-to-one program, so it's not going to happen for us. So that does concern me, that idea is out there.
I'll flip that on its head, though. And I can't speak from a national perspective. All I can talk about is our perspective here in Iowa. But in Iowa, at least of the 300 and some school districts, it's some insane number that have self-funded one-to-one programs. I mean, it's over 60%. I think it's north of 70%.
Yeah, the tipping point.
Yeah, it's there. It really is, and I think the writing's on the wall that everybody's going to have to do that to stay competitive. And I think one of the things that's most interesting about UPAR to me is the nature of that it can be universally used in that regard. So it's not just it's a strength-based choice, and it plays into that advocacy conversation that we were having earlier, and that Maggie surfaced. That agency advocacy choice. But the idea that it also, I talk a lot about amplifying a kid's strength. It also sort of mutes their, I don't even want to use the word disability, but their areas where they're not so strong. And that's true across the board for the kids who are identified and they're receiving, very structured services, but it hits everybody. And I think it's that classic sort of UDL thinking of, a high tide floats all boats. Yeah. It just seems like such an easy thing to do. Low hanging fruit is the metaphor I use all the time.
Well, one of the things that I think is really exciting in terms of muting one's disability is that we're now getting reports from districts, and we need more of this information. So all of you out here who are using UPAR, this is the information we most need to make the case to other school districts or even to departments of education, is that kids who have these major discrepancies identified by UPAR, and then the kids get access to read aloud tools, and they use them consistently because they want to use them consistently. They own it now. People are tracking the number of hours and minutes that these kids are now reading books. And, the more kids read, the more eyes on print, the more time on task. We are now looking at schools where they're demonstrating to the benefits that go beyond just being able to successfully read with a read aloud tool. Because what we're hearing now is that these kids without a text reader, when you do the reading assessments with them at the end of the year, their reading scores with no help whatsoever are going up. And the only thing that's changed in their life is the addition of text to speech. Their reading interventions have stayed the same. Their classroom has stayed the same. They haven't changed schools. Nothing else has really changed remarkably in their life.
Positive feedback loop. That's what I was saying earlier. Exactly.
So these kids are really, and then today I was talking to my colleague in the district that I used to work in, and she was saying that the end of the year Maryland state tests, the MAP tests, they're called MAP-R tests, that in this one particular school where they've really made a real effort to begin with UPAR and get text readers readily available for kids, that these kids actually increased their MAP-R scores 20 points. And it's actually closing the gap. That we're always talking about that discrepancy gap between typical kids and kids with disabilities. So it's actually closing that gap. I mean, it's not closed completely yet, but it is made a huge leap in closing that gap in just a very short period of time. So that's pretty exciting too. I actually think this is a perfect storm right now. And the perfect storm is is so many things: the availability of mobile technology, the move to one-to-one technologies, the focus on data, which is why I think UPAR, people buy into it because it's data-based. It's providing not one student at a time data, it's providing group data. And so people can see large numbers of kids who who might benefit from this, and then schools sort of take a different tack. So that plus universal design for learning, as you were mentioning, plus the availability of books via Bookshare, plus curriculums going more digital so that text is more, I think it's like the perfect storm right now.
Yeah, it fits right into what we were talking about in our last episode, which is open educational resources. Now, not all those are like completely accessible, but certainly you can imagine scenarios where they would be, because many of them can be digital. And in fact, I think forward-looking institutions would demand that.
Yeah.
What do you see is kind of on the horizon for UPAR? What's just over the horizon that maybe the rest of us haven't seen yet?
We are talking about some modifications to UPAR. We think we need more passages because people want to use it to probe kids more often. So we are talking about some, I think, upgrades to it with John Johnson. So we're planning on that. So that's down the road. But I really think. I was in Iowa, your home state, just on a panel with people, and Maggie's too, and everybody's here is home state. And the panelists were talking about what they're doing relative to UPAR, and it really struck me that it's not UPAR. Just happens to be the fire starter, the fire starters you put into your oven or your stove or your fireplace kind of thing to get the fire going. That it's kind of the fire starter. That it's not really about UPAR. It's about UPAR in the context of so many other things. We have spent so much time trying to, as special educators, advocate for the rights of access to technology, and we've talked to curriculum, and we've talked to all sorts of people to try to get the right to access for kids. We've used the AT consideration process, and none of those things have been effective at getting these kinds of results. And what DeWitt shared with us in terms of at this panel was their 5-step process for AIM. They have a very clear process, and I think that's what's down the road, is a very clear process for people to identify which kids should have PAR administered to them, and a very clear thought about who are they going to flag for the use of UPAR. The data then from UPAR just ignites the conversation about, oh, wow, this is amazing. We've got to do something about this. We don't have enough human readers in our school. We've got to consider what we're going to do in terms of using technology. And then getting, because UPAR is still only the igniter. The thing that has to happen after that is part of the process, and people need to be able to see that process, is teachers now have to get to the point where they have other procedures in place to get access to the digital texts, and make it really happen on an everyday basis. So I would like to see that UPAR is just one piece. It's the igniter, but it's a piece of a whole.
So it's interesting that you bring up Mississippi Ben's DeWitt's 5-step process that they're utilizing. We've kind of taken that 5-step process, we've tweaked it a little bit, and we've actually recommended to our folks who are leading our MTSS, our multi-tiered system of support, that we utilize this process not just for kids with disabilities, but as part of a multi-tiered system. We have used universal screeners in place to flag those students who may not be reading at grade level. Why not use that information as the initial step? Hey, these kids might need help. Doesn't matter if you're an English learner. Doesn't matter if you have a disability. Doesn't matter if you're the quiet kid that sits in the corner that's just kind of floated by. You're going to get what you need based on the data that we have. And I think that that's the power, like you said, behind data, is that this tool and these supports, when used in that type of structure, can be so beneficial and so powerful for so many.
So yeah. I want to rewind here. We probably should have done this like instantly when we started the show. But it occurs to me that we've talked a lot about UPAR, but we haven't really explicitly stated
what it is
and what it does. And I think the thing that's interesting about UPAR versus PAR, and you hit on this, and I'm going to give you a chance to explain that in just a second here. But is that I think it allows it to come to scale. And that's what's really, really super interesting to me, because I could see it as a universal tier. I mean, I want to see this eventually. If I was staying at Prairie, I would push hard that we would give it to all kids in 4th grade, that every kid, and then it's a preference, right? It's not based around, yeah, sure, our data is telling this, but we're starting to develop a real evidence-based profile of where a kid's strengths lay. And then we can start working on that and amplifying those strengths while not totally, disengaging with the other things we've got to teach them, because that's our job. But I think that's really important. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly UPAR does first before we dig into
thought about that, though, and then I'll talk about that. It doesn't have to be a disability focus either, right? I mean, a lot of the kids that don't have disabilities, the student who, again, as somebody said, is sitting off in the corner kind of thing and is totally disengaged. Why is that student disengaged, right? But I've heard teachers talk about the fact that they want their whole class to take part in UPAR. It doesn't cost any more to do that if you've got a site license. So to take part in UPAR, because they want to know if they send them out on the internet to do research, and can they handle materials out there on the internet that are well above grade level. And will they be able to, with the use of a text reader, be able to comprehend some of the more complex text that's out there. So, I mean, that's a really good reason to look at read aloud tools as a natural support for somebody who's there is no disability whatsoever, So, so what the difference between UPAR and PAR? So the first thing that Linda and I designed with PAR, it's a paper-based tool. We designed it because even though our team had, if you combine the number of years of experience in assistive technology, it was, like a lot of years of experience in technology, a lot of years. But we still didn't find that we could figure out who benefited from a text reader and who didn't. We just felt like it was just as educated guesswork. Is that all that it was? But we knew we needed a mousetrap. We needed a better way to figure out, without wasting everybody's time, who would benefit from it and who wouldn't benefit from it. So the paper-based version of UPAR is different. They're not equivalent, and I think that's important for people to know. So there are 3 conditions under regular PAR and under UPAR. Under paper-based, the regular paper-based version of PAR, the student actually reads aloud in a one-to-one kind of setting, and then the teacher asks comprehension questions. And then the student is put onto a human reader, an adult reader, a human reader condition, as an adult reader, not a digitized human reader, but an actual human reader. And we look at how does the student do in terms of comprehending what they read after being read to by an adult. And then the third condition is the use of whatever text reader is available at that school. When it became when Don Johnston said, gee, we really, really would like to see if we could make this computer-based and make it a group, and it is the first group assessment tool in the field of assistive technology, the first condition is different now. The first condition is the student reads silently because the text is simply on the screen and he just reads silently and answers the comprehension questions. And then the second condition is a digital human voice that is reading the passage. And then the third condition is a text reader with a more computerized voice reading the passage. So I actually recommend that schools have both, because sometimes with some kids, you'll really want to do it one-on-one because you really think there's something going on. Maybe you'll do UPAR with them and it'll show no benefit, right, at this time. And you want to know, I want to know really why it's no benefit. So I want to sit with the student and really see how he performs with these slightly different kinds of tools. And it can give you a lot of information just sitting with that student that you might not have had in a group administered situation. So it's it's the beauty of that one-to-one kind of interaction that really I think is the biggest benefit of paper-based UPAR. But the more computerized, more automatized kind of version of UPAR is that you can assess a group of kids, 20 kids at a time. The teacher can see the data on what they call the educator dashboard. As the kids are taking the test, she can see what's happening. She can see that kids are actually able to go to higher and higher levels of reading ability, so they can follow along with the students. And then after it's over, it's immediate results. You don't have to wait until somebody scores it, or you don't have to wait a week or so. So it's immediate feedback, and teachers find that they just can't wait to pull the kids aside and say to them, "Look at your data. This is what it's telling us. This is what you can do." I mean, I heard a story yesterday about a student, and this is scary for me. He has CP, intellectually disabled, and that's his identification, reading at an early elementary level. But when they put him on UPAR, they just found that he could read way above grade level. I mean, way above grade level. I mean, not 5 years above grade level. I mean, way above grade level. And the child himself was ecstatic. But how do we label a kid intellectually disabled? How does that happen? How does that kind of discrepancy occur? How do we miss that? That's kind of scary to me.
Yeah, having my youngest son is pretty developmentally delayed, and it needs augmented technology. I think a lot about that question right there. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. It inspires, and it's the stuff of dreams and nightmare.
Yeah,
right?
Dreams and nightmare. I mean, teachers really sometimes they see the data and they get very upset because they said, how could we not know? And it sort of just reinforces what Linda and I started out thinking, which is it's just, you can't know. It's like it's an invisible disability. It's educated guesswork. So you have to have a process and you have to have data. So.
Yeah. So I'm a high school person, so I don't really get to see students at the earliest levels. Mm-hmm. But this year we had to help as instructional coaches with some of the phonics testing going in our district. And that's one-on-one where, you're listening to them say the letter sounds and letters and all that. And so I know nothing about that. So I had to be trained in it. But it was interesting to me just because of the data I was getting just by interacting with that student one-on-one, figuring out what was, identifying issues just by, getting that data on a piece of paper, but also just listening to them. You need that information. And so this was just one of many assessments that they're using. So I still know I already forgot the specific tool they're using just because I was brought in last minute and they had to make sure I could actually hear the kids correctly, which was my issue. But yeah, no, that data is very important, especially because, technically we tested my son's class in first grade. And so I was very interested in his data just to see if there's anything, even as a parent, I missed.
Right. Now, it concerns me that, a lot of people originally, and I think this is the thing that PAR has really helped with, would say, well, we won't do anything like PAR until we can see that he's really not doing well, right? Mm-hmm. So it's this wait to fail kind of model. So the student, gets reading intervention for years and years and years and years and years. And finally somebody says, let's do something about it. There's no reason that those two things can't co-occur, that they can't go in parallel, that the use of read-aloud tools can be parallel with reading interventions, and that should start very early. I mean, if we're still looking at high school kids who don't know basic phonics, there is something really wrong here with that picture. It may be that these kids, you talk to dyslexic adults and they will tell you, stop it already. I mean, these teachers should have stopped intervention with me ages ago and just given me the tools I really needed to survive, because I'm going to be dyslexic my whole life. So I think the data collection.
True.
Yeah, right, exactly. Spoken by somebody who knows, right? So these kids, we need to know when to stop reading intervention. I'm not an advocate of stopping reading interventions. I think they can occur in parallel, but there comes to a point in a certain kid's life where I think it's cruel in some ways to keep making them go through the same interventions when it is likely a disability that a lifelong disability.
Yeah, and especially with I see text-to-speech tools improving greatly. I mean, so Google earlier this year at their developers conference introduced the new tool that's coming out, their Google Assistant, which pretty much they had it on stage, make a haircut appointment for somebody, and their digital tool, in a sense, spoke perfectly like a human. There was pauses, there was ums, and there's all that. And so if you take that same technology and put in text to speech, you get very far away from the robotic voice of like Stephen Hawking robotic voice to something that is very, very natural. And so it's only going to get better and better and better and more accessible. So why not make those available?
Why not make those available? From early on. Why do we have to wait for a wait to fail? I mean, there was a story that I heard about a couple of weeks ago about a young man who was in high school, and he was at an elementary level of reading, and on UPAR he was reading on grade level. This was a kid who was getting ready to graduate, and it changed. I think he was graduating in another year, and they were having long discussions about putting this child into a vocational program. And then when they discovered just how much he could comprehend, it changed the conversation. And it not only changed the conversation about how we should be reading, but it changed the conversation about his future, about the trajectory of his future. And that is amazing. So just amazing.
Life-changing.
Yeah,
it certainly is. And again, it's all about, to me, it's all about building and amplifying kids' strengths, all kids, not just the special ed kids, not just the kids with an identified goal. And certainly, we need to take care of those kids. I'm not suggesting that we give them less anything, but I think it mutes their disability when everybody has access to the same stuff. And it goes to that shame issue we were talking about earlier. Well, we're right at the 40-minute mark here, and I want to honor everybody's time. So I want to see if kind of do a whip around here, see if anybody has any last thoughts. They're dying to get out because this has been just incredibly rich conversation. So Maggie, we'll start with you. Anything for the team here?
You know, I like to learn something new every day. And when I talk with Denise, I learn like 10 things just in this hour that we've been chatting. So thanks, Denise. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. And thanks for all your work out there. Anybody who's got data out there about kids who've been identified by UPAR, then been using read aloud tools consistently, and result in positive results in any format of improvements in reading or improvements in academic achievement scores or state level tests, we'd love to hear from you, because that's the kind of data that we're looking for now, so that we can take that story, take that information to the powers that be at higher levels. You know, not just at the classroom level, not just at the school level, but at, you know, the district level and the state level.
Absolutely. Patrick, what do you got?
Well, talking about the data, and that's some of the stuff you've been able to share tonight. That's great, because, you know, I've been brought up to mind. I see this kind of fear almost among some educators of the role that technology is playing in education, and whether they're afraid it's going to replace them or whatnot, or they're afraid of the possible distractions or misuse. And so I do see some teachers trying to go back to paper-based and, you know, text-based, and yet they're not realizing that they're missing the boat for so many students, and almost making it impossible for those students to be successful because they're trying to focus on a certain type of student. So it's one of those things where I want to share that data with our teachers just to make sure they understand why you need to be using these tools, or at least making sure your students can use them. When you go read outside with a book, well, that's great for some students, but you're just leaving a lot of students behind.
And I'll just close out with saying that the power of universal design for learning as an educational framework, or personalized learning, or whatever framework you might be using in your district, is changing the face of education. And so I understand why teachers are a little nervous about it, because I do think it's changing. We are not going to be the stand and deliver people anymore. That's not going to be our role anymore. We are going to, in one-to-one programs going forward, we're going to be learning coaches. We're going to be coaching kids to rise to the level of their ability, and we're going to make sure that they get the materials that they need to be independent learners and self-driven learners. And I think it is changing the face of education. I think we're going to deliver education very differently, you know, 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the role of the teachers fundamentally changed, at least in the 25 years I've been in there. I don't think it's, as you say, stand and deliver. I love that terminology. I think you have to be a designer now,
yeah.
and not just a content, you know, someone who pushes content. So.
Oh, and I can put a plug in, because you just reminded me that Learning Designed is a new website, web platform in development right now that focuses on universal design for learning. It's going to be launched by the fall, and there will be many hundreds of resources in there on universal design for learning. And there will also be the very first voluntary UDL associate level credential, where people can go in, take a mini course, learn about UDL. It's role agnostic. It could be a teacher, a software developer. It's for anyone. And then over time, there are going to be more voluntary credentials added to this, and certifications for schools added to this, because I think professional development is also moving in a very different direction, and we're moving into an era of personalizing our learning. And this is
for everyone, right? For everybody, teachers, staff, all of them. Well, Denise, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was a great conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it was delightful. So again, thanks for joining us. We're going to wrap it up here, and we hope to see you all again at our next broadcast. Take care, all.
Take care. Good night, everyone.